Yes, of course deficits matter. Sometimes they can be helpful. For example, when the economy needs a boost or a stimulus if it's in a recession. Sometimes they can be harmful. For example, if we build up increasing amounts of debt over time that place burdens on future generations and crowd out capital. But the short answer is yes, deficits do matter.
All right, let me be more specific. And Art, I'll start with you. Does the deficit that we're looking at right now matter?
Yes, of course it does. I agree with Bill 100%. But net deficits matter in the sense that they increase total debt. And I think it's really debt that you want to talk about that matters here. And, you know, debt's a big issue. When you had that $22 trillion number put on the screen, you know, that's not a good number. I mean, that includes intergovernmental debt, which shouldn't be included. The number really is about 16 trillion, which is still a huge, huge number. But that absolute level of the debt really shouldn't be used either because, frankly, when a country is very, very wealthy, they can afford to have more debt than countries that are poor or small, just like a person with a big house can have a bigger mortgage than someone with a smaller house. So when you look at these things, I like to look at debt compared to wealth, net debt compared to wealth, and I'd like to look at interest payments compared to GDP. And in both those measures, right now, Becky, those numbers are not rising. They're staying about level and have been for a while.
Bill, what do you think? Is that how you would look at it?
I agree with a lot of what Art just said. In particular, I think the $22 trillion number should be banished from public discussion and use the $16 trillion number. I do think the concern is not so much the current level of interest payments and the current debt, but where we're headed. If you look at the next 10, 20, 30 years, everything's going haywire. Net interest payments are rising dramatically. The debt and the deficit are rising dramatically. And I think that's the real concern. I don't think that we need to cut the deficit right now, but we need to put into place a gradual phase-in of tax increases and spending cuts.
Hey, Art.
Yes.
Steve Liesman, I have.
Hi, Steve. By the way, good segment.
Oh, thank you so much. It's really hard to do.
I'm really working on that stuff a lot with you, and you presented it very, very nicely.
Thank you very much. I just want to ask you a question now.
Sure.
I have corporate taxes down 21% year over year.
Yes.
So I just want to know where you stand on the issue of are these tax cuts paying for themselves?
Yeah, the corporate tax cuts, taxes are down a lot more than that, Steve. If you really look at a quarter-over-quarter moving average, it's down about 35–40%. But we always thought corporate taxes would be down. Non-corporate tax revenues are rising dramatically. In fact, they're the highest increase in probably 5 years. So when you add the two together, total federal taxes. Now, I use the National Income and Product Account, BEA numbers, which you should use, which are accruals. You find total taxes are up nicely year over year on the moving average. So it's a good number, best in 4 or 5 years.
All right, let's talk offline about what numbers you're using, because I have individual income taxes down 5.4%. Year over year. I've got the individual down, and I got the corporate side down. I have a hard time finding.
Those numbers I think you're talking about, Steve, are the numbers for the first 4 months of this year. Am I right?
No, I'm using year over year data, year to date.
But you're using Treasury numbers, which are cash flow. You've got to use accruals. You really do. You have to use accruals because they're the right measures.
Come in on this.
Yeah,
I mean,
I think the main point is that everybody except Kevin Hassett and the CEA thinks that the tax cut reduced revenues. You've got consulting firms, you've got CBO and Joint Tax Committee, you've got various think tanks, Tax Policy Center, Tax Foundation. It really shouldn't be a debate about whether the tax cut reduced revenues. It's clear that it did. It did some other things too, but in terms of the revenue front, I just don't think it's a debate.
I disagree with you, Bill, on that. I mean, honestly, we're way above the baseline for both the Tax Foundation and the Joint Committee on Taxation and the Congressional Budget Office. We're way above baseline on revenues coming in. I mean, we really are. And we had about $250 billion coming in and repatriated funds taxes. So that was in the fourth quarter of 2017, which you've got to include in this as well, because that's part of the tax bill is the repatriation of funds. So when you look at it, I just don't think you're right, but I'd be glad to go through the numbers with you carefully.
I'm gonna talk to both these guys offline. Beck, I'll come back next week after 3 more days of digging a hole on the deficit.
Can I say one thing, Becky, about debt?
Sure.
Yeah, one thing. You know, when you look at debt, debt depends upon the interest spread. If you can borrow all you want at 1% and lend all you want at 10% risk-free, how much should you borrow? Everything in the world. Now reverse those numbers. Borrow all you want at 10% and lend all you want at 1%. How much should you borrow? Nothing. Debt is a tool. It's a tool to get a spread to returns. Now, when we came into office in '81, we took on a lot of debt. That's true with the Reagan administration. But look at what we did with it. We created enormous economic growth and prosperity, which was well worth taking on the debt. The key issue here is, what do you do with the money you borrow? Do you create more growth? Or do you just pay people not to work? That's where you really should look, is what we do with the dollars we use, not whether it's debt or not.
Art and Bill, Sam Zell is our guest host today, and I think he has a thought on this as well.
No, I think what Art's saying is exactly right. I mean, the big concern that I've had is that we're spending our tax revenue in a manner that is not productive to the economy, creating new jobs, creating new assets. Instead, we're spending it on, you want a job, you can have it, and if you don't want a job, we'll pay you anyway. Stuff like that is just.
Well, I looked at the numbers for I looked at the numbers for the first 4 months, and I know that part of the reason the deficit is up just for the first 4 months of this fiscal year is that we're spending more on defense. Our interest payments have gone up, and we're spending more on Social Security. I think those were the three biggest items.
Yes. The federal government is a big retirement and health care program with the biggest military in world history attached to it. That's all it is. It's not paying people not to work. It's paying retirees, and it's paying Medicare and Medicaid. I mean, it's not that complicated, right?
No, it's not. And I think the thing that people forget, and the thing that makes me so angry about, is when people say, well, the government should be more like business. Well, guess what, folks? The government is the government because it's not business. We give stuff to the government to do that business doesn't want to do and aren't otherwise productive for the government to do. And here's an example, slightly related here, which is that we might cut the corporate tax and it may not pay for itself, but we might have a whole bunch of other reasons for cutting the corporate taxes. In other words, the taxes of the U.S. Now, that doesn't mean everything is a free lunch, and that's the problem. And I want to get, sorry, Becky, I want to get William Gale to respond to that. There's social functions that are involved in why we do things. I personally like the idea of cutting the corporate taxes. I think other loopholes should have been removed to make it more revenue neutral on the corporate side. I think that was a mistake that was made. I don't think it should have ended up being such a huge increase for the deficit.
Bill, go ahead and respond to that. I'd like to come back to the interest rates at 1.2, but Bill, go ahead and respond to Steve's point.
The tax cut, I felt, was largely the wrong thing at the wrong time. It fails a long-term growth test. It makes the distribution of income less equal. It loses revenues by every conventional measure. I think if you ask yourself, if you had $1.5 trillion or $2 trillion, what would you have done to make the economy better, to help people? I don't think the tax cut would have been the answer.
Let me throw out just.
Can I interrupt 1 second?
Yeah, go ahead, Sam.
Nancy Pelosi in 2008 had $1 trillion to spend. The opportunity to create enormous growth, shovel ready for that $1 trillion was there. And what did they spend it on? Non-productive increments to social programs. You do that, the $1 trillion is going to be there to be paid back someday, and that's where debt matters.
Sam, you're my hero.
Can I just very quickly bring this up? And we're out of time. The interest rates, though, the idea that higher payments on our debt, on the interest on that, was one of the three big issues that really pushed us in a tougher direction. This came at a time when interest rates were really maintained low. What happens if we actually see much higher rates?
The share of the government spending that goes towards interest rate will rise and rise sharply.
These fights are going to get harder and harder.
This is, Becky, the question of our time. And it's a question of investment. It's a question of policy, which is the extent to which we should rely upon low interest rates for the foreseeable future. If you're Sam Zell, you can go to the bank and say, give me money for 10 years, and you're set. That's not true for the federal government, which can sort of term stuff out, but it's a question for Federal Reserve policy, a question for budget policy, it's a question for investment policy. And closely related to that is, where is the right growth rate? Can we do 3% sustained, or is 2% the right speed limit? You answer those questions, folks, you will be rich.